In the winter of 2024, the wilderness of the Cascade Mountains did not just hold snow, it held a silence so absolute that it felt alive. For Andrew, a 34-year-old insurance analyst from Seattle, that silence was exactly what he thought he needed. His cubicle on the 14th floor of a downtown high-rise had become a claustrophobic cage. Day after day, he stared at spreadsheets, listened to the monotonous drone of corporate conference calls, and felt his youth slipping away into a void of digital numbers. When his younger sister announced her engagement, a sudden sharp panic gripped him. He was turning 34, unmarried, unfulfilled, and drowning in a slow professional death. He needed to prove to himself that he was still capable of facing the raw, untamed world. He needed to know he could still do hard things. The weather forecast that Friday morning promised clear blue skies for the entire weekend. Andrew checked his gear twice in his small apartment. He packed his backpack with standard winter hiking equipment, a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, a portable camp stove, a knife, a headlamp, and rations for 3 days. He had hiked the Snow Peak Trail twice before, but always in the lush, crowded months of July and August. He knew the trail map by heart, or at least he believed he did. In the summer, the 6-mile trek to the summit ridge was a beautiful, moderate challenge marked by wildflowers and clear dirt paths. He assumed that with snowshoes and a solid pair of boots, the winter version would simply be a quieter, more scenic iteration of the same route. He did not account for how completely the snow obliterates landmarks, turning a familiar landscape into an alien world. He reached the trailhead parking lot at 7 a.m. on Saturday. His car was the only one there. The air was crisp and biting, leaving a white plume of vapor every time he exhaled. Strapping on his snowshoes and hoisting the heavy pack onto his shoulders, Andrew felt a sudden rush of adrenaline. This was the adventure he had been craving. The first 2 miles went smoothly. The trail wound through a dense forest of Douglas firs, their branches heavy with thick blankets of white snow. The only sound was the rhythmic crunching of his snowshoes cutting into the fresh powder. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting long, dramatic shadows across the pristine white floor. Andrew felt a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He was doing it. He was leaving the spreadsheets behind. By noon, Andrew cleared the tree line and emerged onto the lower ridge of Snow Peak. The wind picked up instantly, whipping cold air across his exposed face. He pulled his wool cap down lower and adjusted his goggles. The view was breathtaking, an endless sea of jagged white peaks cutting into a pale blue sky. But as he looked ahead, he noticed that the clear summer trail was completely gone, buried under 6 feet of hard-packed snow and shifting drifts. He pulled out his phone to check his GPS app, but the intense cold had already drained the battery from 80% to a dead black screen. Andrew paused, a slight flutter of unease stirring in his stomach. He looked back at his own tracks stretching into the trees behind him. He looked ahead at the vast, featureless white slope. He convinced himself that as long as he kept the high ridge to his left, he could not possibly lose his way. An hour later, the blue sky began to pale. The weather forecast had been wrong. A wall of gray slate was rolling in from the west, moving with terrifying speed. Before Andrew could fully register the change, the sun was swallowed whole. The temperature plummeted, and the wind began to howl, kicking up loose snow until the horizon vanished. Within 20 minutes, Andrew was caught in a full-blown mountain whiteout. The world became a terrifying, featureless void of blinding white. He could not tell where the ground ended and the sky began. He took a step forward, his foot sinking deep into a hidden depression, causing him to stumble and fall hard onto his chest. As he pushed himself up, wiping the ice from his goggles, he turned around to look for his tracks. They were already gone, erased by the driving wind and drifting snow. Panic, cold and sharp, set in. Andrew knew he had to find shelter immediately. He could not pitch his tent in winds this high. The fabric would tear to shreds. He decided to head downward, back toward the perceived safety of the tree line. But without a compass or a visual reference point, his sense of direction was completely warped. He walked for what felt like hours, his legs burning with exhaustion, his fingers growing numb inside his heavy gloves. The snow grew deeper, dragging at his snowshoes. The storm showed no signs of abating. Instead, the wind grew louder, screaming through the mountain passes like a chorus of dying animals. Just as his strength was about to give out entirely, Andrew saw a dark, irregular shape jutting out from the side of a steep slope. He scrambled toward it, collapsing against a massive outcrop of black volcanic rock. Beneath the overhang of the rock was a shallow, naturally formed cave, barely deep enough for a man to sit upright, but completely shielded from the howling wind. Andrew crawled inside, dragging his pack behind him. The sudden absence of the wind was a profound relief. He stripped off his wet gloves, fumbled with his pack, and pulled out his sleeping bag. He crawled inside it, shivering violently, pulling the hood tight around his face. He lay there in the dark, listening to the roaring storm outside, waiting for the night to pass. He awoke hours later to a profound, unnatural stillness. The storm had stopped. Andrew checked his watch. The glowing dial read 2:14 a.m. The air inside the small stone alcove was freezing. Breathing felt like inhaling shards of glass. He was about to drift back into a restless sleep when he heard a sound that made his heart freeze in his chest. It was a crunching sound. The distinct rhythmic compression of snow coming from just outside the cave entrance. Andrew remained perfectly still, holding his breath. He told himself it was a deer or perhaps a mountain goat. But the footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and irregular. They did not sound like a four-legged animal. They sounded like something heavy walking upright on two legs. The steps grew closer, stopping directly outside the narrow opening of his rock shelter. Andrew's eyes strained against the pitch blackness. Through the small opening, against the faint starlit glow of the snow outside, a silhouette blocked the light. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, but its proportions were distorted. The shoulders were hunched and unnaturally wide, and its head sat low on its torso, tilting from side to side with a sickening, jerky motion. Andrew wanted to scream, but his throat was dry, locked in a tight knot of pure terror. The creature did not enter the cave. Instead, it leaned down, and Andrew heard a long, wet sniff. The thing was smelling the air, catching his scent. Then it let out a sound that Andrew would never forget. It was not a roar or a growl. It was a low, guttural mimicry of a human chuckle, a dry, raspy sound that rattled in its chest. The silhouette turned and slowly moved away, the heavy thuds of its footsteps fading into the distance. Andrew did not sleep for the rest of the night. He sat in the darkness, clutching his small pocket knife with numb, useless fingers, staring at the cave entrance until the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the cracks. When morning finally arrived, the sky was clear again, a cruel parody of the beautiful day before. Andrew crawled out of the cave, his joints stiff and aching from the cold. He looked down at the pristine snow outside his shelter. There were no animal paws, no human boots. There were only deep, massive, oval depressions in the snow, spaced nearly 4 feet apart, leading down into the dense forest below. The strides were far too long for any human, and the weight required to sink that deeply into the packed ice was immense. Desperate to escape, Andrew packed his gear with frantic, trembling hands. He didn't care about the summit anymore. He only cared about survival. He began his descent, following the general direction of the valley below, hoping to intersect the main trail or find the creek bed that led back to the parking lot. The snow was deep, and without the trail markers, every ridge looked identical. By noon, his legs were trembling with fatigue. His water supply had frozen solid inside his pack, and hunger was a dull, persistent ache in his stomach. As he walked through a grove of ancient cedar trees, a strange sensation crept over him. The forest had gone dead silent. The birds that had been chirping moments ago were suddenly gone. The wind had died down to nothing. Andrew stopped, his breath catching in his throat. He looked around the towering trees, their trunks thick and dark against the white snow. He felt eyes on him. It was the distinct, unmistakable pressure of being hunted. He heard a sharp snap to his left. He spun around, his eyes scanning the dense brush. Nothing. Then a branch cracked to his right. He turned again, faster this time, his heart hammering against his ribs. A shadow flitted between two large fir trees about 50 yards away. It moved with an impossible fluid speed, gliding over the deep snow without the struggle that Andrew was enduring. It was circling him, keeping its distance, playing with him. Andrew broke into a frantic run. He abandoned all caution, plunging down the steep slope, his snowshoes throwing up clouds of white powder. He tripped over a buried log, tumbling head over heels down a small ravine, his backpack tearing open and scattering his gear across the snow. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the sharp pain in his twisted ankle. He left the pack behind, keeping only the small knife in his jacket pocket. He ran blindly, driven by pure primal instinct. Behind him, he could hear the creature pursuing. It was no longer trying to be quiet. It was crashing through the underbrush, snapping thick branches with ease. And as it ran, it began to make sounds. It was mimicking him. Andrew heard the sound of his own heavy breathing, his own panicked gasps projected back at him from the trees ahead, but distorted, amplified, and mocking. The forest began to thin, and Andrew recognized a familiar clearing. It was the lower junction of the Snow Peak Trail, barely a mile from the parking lot. Hope flared in his chest. He pushed his body past its limits, ignoring the agony in his ankle and the burning in his lungs. He could see the wooden trailhead sign just ahead. But as he reached the clearing, a towering figure stepped out from behind the final row of trees, blocking the path entirely. Andrew skidded to a halt, his boots bearing into the snow. In the bright daylight, he could finally see the entity clearly, and the sight nearly broke his mind. It was a humanoid figure, but its skin was a pale, mottled gray, stretched so tightly over its skeletal frame that its ribs and long vertebrae were clearly visible. Its arms were unnaturally long, ending in thick, blackened fingers with jagged claws. But the face was the most horrifying part. It had no nose, only two vertical slits, and its eyes were massive, glassy black orbs that reflected the white landscape. Its mouth was a wide, lipless tear that stretched from ear to ear, filled with rows of jagged, needle-thin teeth. It was completely naked, yet it didn't seem to feel the sub-zero temperature. It stood there, towering over him, its head tilting with that same jerky, unnatural motion he had seen the night before. Andrew fell to his knees, completely exhausted, his strength entirely spent. He raised the small pocket knife, a pathetic defense against a nightmare. The creature looked down at him, its massive black eyes locking onto his. The wide, lipless mouth opened, and from its throat came a voice. It was not a monster's roar. It was a perfect, flawless imitation of Andrew's own voice, using the exact words he had spoken in his Seattle apartment just days prior. Turning 34 in a cubicle felt like a slow death, the creature whispered, the tone perfectly capturing Andrew's own existential despair. I needed to prove something to myself, I guess. That I could still do hard things. The creature took a slow step forward, its long arms reaching out, its fingers twitching with anticipation. Andrew realized then that the wilderness had not offered him an escape from his slow death. It had merely provided a faster, infinitely more terrifying one. He closed his eyes as the shadow fell over him, the sound of his own mocked laughter echoing through the silent, frozen trees.